I'm sure you've guessed, I'm not Neil. Unfortunately, Neil's unable to make it because he's had the Ofsted phone call. So I'm standing in his chair this afternoon. And you'll have to just bear with me, as obviously it's the first time I've done it, and I've just returned from isolation, so COVID brain is still there a little bit. But I just have to remind you all that the meeting is recorded. Usual protocols, please. If you have something to say, if you can just raise your hand and we'll come to you at the most appropriate time, and we'll make our way through the agenda. Fred, is there anything else that we need to announce before we get going with the meeting in terms of protocols?
No, we're okay to go, Chair.
Okay. So item 1 on the agenda then is apologies for absence. And obviously, as I've said, we've had apologies from Neil, our chair, who's got Ofsted in this week. Fred, have we had any other apologies?
Yes, Chair. We've also had apologies from Emma Pate, from Mark Arnold, from Christina Handy-Rivet, and from Elaine Benbow. Okay. I've just checked as well, Chair, and we are quorum, so we're okay.
We are quorum. Lovely, thank you. Neil, did you have something to say?
Yeah, just say I think I'll just pass on Darren Barton's apologies, which is the reason that I am here.
Thank you, Phil.
Jeez.
Fred, you confirm we are quorum, so that's good to go.
Yeah.
So agenda item 2 then, any declarations of pecuniary interest that are different? Right. Okay, lovely. So item 3, minutes of a meeting held on the 17th of January. So you've got those on pages 9 to 24. I don't propose that we go through them page by page. You've all had a chance to read them and review them, I presume. So can I propose that those are an accurate record of the last meeting? Is everybody happy with that? And any comments about those minutes? Any comments or questions arising from those minutes? No? Okay. So moving on then, item 4, fair funding.
Sorry, Chair. Just to move on to that, we've also to confirm Alison Connop as your substitute as well.
Apologies, yeah, sorry. So under item 3.1, Alison Connop, it's Connop with 2 N's, not Connop, has been put forward as the nominated substitute for me if I'm absent from Schools Forum. So that's gone through the appropriate channels and we'd like to put that forward as a recommendation. So do we need to vote on that, Fred?
Yes, please, Chair.
Yeah. So, and can you raise your hand then if you are happy to approve Alison Connor, the head of Grovell, as my nominated substitute? Okay, so that's 7 votes that I can see. Any against? Anybody abstaining?
I think it's carried then, Chair.
Yeah, that's 7 votes.
And also, just bring your attention, sorry, I just had a message, Jamie. Lynn Howard is going to be joining us, but she might be a little bit late.
Okay, all right, thank you. So moving on then, agenda item 4, fair funding, outsourcing update. So Rose, can I hand it over to you for this report?
Yes, you can. Thanks, Chair.
Can I just ask, sorry, Rose, before you get going, is somebody unmuted? I can hear a noise, but some background noise. That's better, thank you.
Yeah, Chair, what I might say to everybody is if you're not speaking, can you mute your microphone, and that will hopefully improve. So when someone's talking, just mute your microphone.
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, thanks. So this report is an update to a report that was taken to Schools Forum in December, and basically it's about the Fair Funding Scheme, or also known as the Scheme of Financing for Schools, and it was with regards to outsourcing by maintained schools, outsourcing of services. We went out to consultation with all of the maintained schools, and that was issued on the via circular on Friday the 11th of February, and remained open initially until Monday the 28th of February, giving 2 weeks for any comments or responses to the updates as detailed in Appendix 1. The consultation was extended to the 4th of March, as we realised that 1 week of the original consultation period covered the February half term, but still we received no comments at all with regards to the proposed changes to the scheme of financing. And basically it was just to really emphasise to maintain schools, if they are thinking about outsourcing any of those services, there are TUPE, where there are TUPE transfer implications, to make the local authority aware as soon as possible, because even though schools can make the decision to outsource service, but as in a lot of the cases, we find that it's the local authority that are still the employer. And so we have to be party to any kind of agreements, pension admission agreements with any proposed service areas. And we just also wanted to highlight within that report in terms of that if the proper processes are not followed, that it could result in former or some of the employees no longer eligible to participate in the West Midlands pension scheme, and that they could suffer significant financial loss. So we just wanted to really highlight the importance of that. So basically we're asking that that the school forum members update the scheme of financing based on the presentation that was made initially in December, and based on the fact that we've received no responses to the consultation that was issued.
Rose, can I ask a question? If a service is already outsourced and the school is making a decision simply to go from one outsourced provider to another outsourced provider, does that still need to be notified to the authority, or is it simply if we're going to an outsourced provider for the first time?
I would have to check on that. But I think it's still good to notify the authority. But yeah, I can come back with a specific response, because we've got a member of staff within the council who has got specialist knowledge on this area. Yeah.
I mean, if that's the case, I just think it would be worth putting that explicitly into Appendix 1 so that everything's absolutely clear. It's not just a case of going for the first time, it might be moving from one provider to another.
Yeah.
Are there any other comments or questions for Rose from anybody else?
Jamie, are you thinking about sort of school lunches, that sort of provision? So
Yeah,
if you
potentially.
outsource your school lunch provider and then you change to a different provider, is that what you're thinking? Something that's an example.
Yeah, that could be one example. Yeah, where it's already with an outsourced provider, but you may be making the decision to change to a different contractor. So I just wanted to be clear that whether we should still notify the authority in that case.
No, I agree with that.
Any other comments or questions? No? Okay, so everybody's happy with that then. We then need to approve that formally. So Rose, can I just clarify, is that again every member of Schools Forum that can vote on that?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
okay. So all those in favour of the update to the scheme for the financing of schools outlined in the report and Appendix 1, if you could raise your hand for me, please. Okay, so that's 9 on the screen, and Bob with his hand up as well. So thank you. Anybody against? And anybody abstaining?
That's carried.
One abstention there.
That's
Thank
carried,
you.
Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So moving on then, item 5, schools budget 22-23. So back to you again, Rose, for this one.
Okay, yeah. So this one, this report is just to inform School Forum members of the school budgets issued for 2022-23. This is in terms of accordance with regulations in notifying schools of their funding. If we look in section 4.1, the schools block funding was distributed through the main funding formula, and that's 304 million. 201,000, and it was calculated based on an initial schools block DSG of 308,463,000, less the national funding formula national non-domestic rates of 2.9 million, and then also after taking into account the agreed pupil number growth contingency for that year of 1.3 million. And so then that leaves this schools block DSG available to distribute of that 304 million that I've just referred to. In terms of the actual funding model that the local authority has to complete was finally approved by the DfE in the second week of December. And the schools block element of funding was issued to schools on Thursday, the 17th of Feb of this year. And that included at the time the basic funding entitlement based on the agreed formula, which is in table 4.4, which I'll go through shortly. The minimum funding guarantee and also adjustments for dedelegations and education functions for maintained schools. In terms of the full school budget information booklet, was which includes early years funding, focus and non-focus provision funding, and illustrative pupil premium grants. That was released to schools on Monday, the 28th of Feb, and is included as Appendix 1. And in terms of under section 4.4, the table, that lists the factors that's agreed for the local authority formula to be applied for 2022-23. Now, the things that we are new for this financial year for 22-23 is the primary secondary ratio has increased from 1.27 to 1.29 for secondaries. There's implementation of the free school meals factor, £176 for both primary and secondary, and then the introduction of the free school meals ever six factor, and you can see the rates there: £161 for primary, £372 for secondary. The MFG, or minimum funding guarantee, was set at 2%, so that's the maximum that we were allowed under the guidance. And in terms of MFG scaling and capping, we didn't have to apply that in order to be able to, we could do that all without having to apply any scaling and capping within the funding allocation that we were given. And so just in terms of, the school's budget information was issued to all head teachers, both academies and maintained schools. So that's there for their guidance throughout the year. And it's just, this report is for noting.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Rose. Any comments or questions from members? Rose, it's not necessarily strictly related to this report, but I suppose it's related to school budgets generally. We're aware as heads and school leaders that our funding is front loaded, we've been told, and we have to prepare for increased costs coming in the future with the money that we've got now. That's the message that's been coming through directly to schools. But it's very difficult sometimes to plan ahead when we have, and it's the same in the authority, I know, when you have such limited financial information. So we have to plan a 3-year budget in schools, but we don't necessarily have the budget information beyond the next year. And I know that at the same time as planning our budgets, we also have to consider our reserve amounts and trying to keep them within a certain parameter. And at the moment, I know that my school, and I'm sure many others, are carrying forward a higher reserve than usual because we are aware of costs coming in the future, which may not be matched with funding. Is there anything the authority can do, or any voice that they can give to school leaders to try and have budget information so that our budgets that we work with are as meaningful as possible, rather than what sometimes feels pie in the sky forecasting?
Okay, I suppose in terms of, we're constrained by the information given to us by government. Yeah. So, we only ever have, normally in terms of, just the 1 year ahead in terms of the funding. And because, as you know, that there's the government have been working towards the implementation of the national funding formula. They're doing it on a phased basis at the moment, and it's always, I suppose, it's about trying to know the direction of travel in terms of, you know, how fast will they go or how slow, and which factors are they, you know, will they make mandatory? Because, as you know, there's some factors which are mandatory at the moment, there's others which are optional. And I know that in terms of the direction of travel, the government has said, you know, they want to be able to, local authorities to implement the national funding formula. They did state that they were going to, you know, that we had that consultation back in the summer, and they were supposed to have issued their response to that prior to December. They've still not released that. So, you know, we're still waiting for that information, really. So that's some of the constraints that we're working under, and why we can't give, you know, we can, you know, give further information to schools. The best potentially that we could do is to model a number of scenarios, but there's not any kind of more firm than that, you know, other than knowing that the government is working towards the national implementation of the national funding formula.
Yeah, thank you, Rose. I appreciate it's not the authorities. I know that you rely on information from government too. I just wondered if any meetings anybody has that has perhaps a louder voice than us, if they can make that view known, that, you know, the more information we get, or the further ahead that it goes, the more meaningful it makes 3-year forecasting, and it would enable us to use our reserves more appropriately rather than just holding on to it on the basis of what might happen in the future. Any other comments from others? Bob?
It's on mute.
Bob, you're on mute.
Normally, we have got a 8% allowed, right? And if we have a more than 8%, and suppose we have a few projects to be done, but it can't be done straight away within the next 12 months. It could take up to 18 months. So how do we explain that one then? You understand where I'm coming from, Jamie?
Are you asking about if we've got projects, so we're holding on to higher reserve than normal?
Mm-hmm.
Rose, is that my understanding correct, that as long as we can justify our reserves, that will be taken into account by the authority?
It was a stance, yeah, that was taken previously, and I think again that probably needs to be re-looked at. But yes, it is something that is taken account. Andy, were you gonna?
Well, I was going to say that, I mean, those are the conversations we've had at QUISPE quite frequently. So, Jamie, when we've looked at surplus or the schools have got, the questions have been asked. But then obviously, the responses will come back. You know, for example, the schools having some, as Bob sort of suggested there, there's some big building projects going on. So we've said, well, OK, then that's fine. And we'll, we sort of monitor it. So if we see it again next year, then we're going, well, last year you said you were going to build something or you were going to do this, and it's still there. So that, I think that's when the concerns come. But I think to sort of say, well, yes, we're having, as you had, Jamie, a lot of building work done. Well, that's fine. We obviously got all the stuff that goes inside, furniture and so on. So you're going to need money for that. So if you're holding money back for that, that's absolutely fine. I think it's when when, as I said, people just almost stockpiling money, and you see these enormous reserves, and that's when I think we have some concerns.
Thank you, Andy. Did that answer your question, Bob?
Thank you.
No problem. Phil?
Yeah, just a question. I mean, you have to bear in mind, Rose, I've not been around for some while, have I? So have the regulations changed regarding carry forwards? Because the 8%, 5% limits that were put on were removed, weren't they, in about 2015, 2012? So has that been changed? So schools are now forced to sort of work to limits, or are they still able to work with their own, with their own numbers really, and still operate as they used to, if you want to? Yeah,
you're right in that they sort of like, it wasn't a statutory requirement, but in terms of for Sandwell, it was parameters that we still wanted to work within and to review schools' budgets. So I don't know if that answers your question, Phil.
Yeah, cheers. So it's a local. What you're saying is it's a bit of local work rather than statutory advice that you've got to apply nationally. So it's just a local decision based on local options. That's fine. Yeah. Cheers.
Any other comments or questions before we move on? Okay, so I think we can minute then. We've noted the contents of that report. Thank you, Fred. Item 6, high needs block, January update. Julie, I'm handing over to you for that one.
Yes, Chair. Sitting in the dark again. Yeah, this is just to provide information to Schools Forum on the budget position as at the 31st of January. The high needs block budget at the moment, as reported in December, is still 53.55 million. The surplus that was reported at the last Schools Forum in January was 1.735 million. That's been revised now to an in-year surplus of 2.389 million. Rather than go through each individual variance, which I do every time, I've just given you a brief summary of what the differences were. So actually the movement between the two. So between the two periods, there's been a movement of 0.654 million. Table 1 explains what makes up that 6.54 million. So following phase transfer, there's been an increase in funding for pupils in other local authority maintained and academy mainstream schools and special schools, both pre and post 16. So that's where we place our children in other local authority maintained and academy schools. That is equated to £176,000. There's been an increase in the assessment for EHCPs, which we've talked about previously. In funding, and this has gone to Sandwell schools. So Sandwell schools have received additional £212,000 for new EHCPs since the last budget monitoring. There's been an increase in the recoupment of pupils in special schools that are the responsibility of other local authorities. So this is where we've got other local authority students in our schools, and there's been a positive movement on that of £628,000. That's the additional money that we're recouping from other local authorities. Again, following phase transfer, there's been an elementary top-up savings for students in mainstream colleges and independent providers of £278,000. So that's where we expected students to go into mainstream colleges or independent ISP providers, where the top-up is either not as much as we anticipated based on the previous cohort, or where those students have moved on to other forms of education or employment. The slippage in staff turnover and other related staff costs to do with that staff turnover of £65,000. And then there's a number of other very small cumulative movements, including slippage in staff vacancies, mediation and hospital education of 71,000, and that gives you the overall movement of 654,000 from the last report. Again, the in-year anticipated surplus added to the board forward will give an estimated amount to carry forward at the 31st of March of 2.986 million. It doesn't mean that the high needs block is in an absolutely fantastic position going forward. It doesn't mean that it's going to be stable. The next course of action from this is to look at the budget, which is also on the agenda, and then do a cash flow over the next 3 or 4 years to see what we think that's going to look, what that will look like, taking into account the new anticipated surplus. So we'll be providing more forecasting as soon as we can. Focus provisions, special schools, occupancy, all our special schools, that's shown at Appendix 2. the average occupancy together with any funded additional places over the financial year based on the annual average. So what we do is we look at what we've funded, what we've commissioned, and then look at the annual average to make sure that, you know, we've not got that many vacancies. The total vacancies under occupancy in focus provision is running at about 3%. Some of that is to do with places that we're still waiting for children to finalise their EHCP to go into those provisions. And that's in primary. In secondary, it's slightly higher at 7%. There's a slight difference in the discrepancies because some of our focus provisions are actually over occupancy. There's a separate report on PRU funding, which is, I think, is the next agenda item. So all that is just for information. There is an appendices 1 and 2, which gives more detail and more information on the occupancy in our special provisions, and also more information on the budget in more detail, should you want to have a look at that. So this is just for information.
Thank you, Julie. Any comments or questions from members?
Julie, can you just explain, sorry, Sally, can you just explain that number 3 in table 1 again? Sorry, I've missed it. You know, the 628,000?
Yes, we've got quite a few students that are in our special schools, and about 1 or 2 in focus provision, which I think is it gives you the numbers, I think, in appendix 2. Let me just go down to appendix 2. I apologise for the formatting of the one report. Fred has sent it out again. It did go out in an Excel format and it was formatted okay, but I think something's happened between it being PDF'd, and I think Fred sent that out again to you. So yes, if you look at appendix 2, it shows you the amount of students that we've got in our schools that are the responsibility of other local authorities. So in our focus provisions overall, we've got 7 students that are other local authority responsibility, where we recoup the top up from that for those students if they lack. If they're not lack, the local authority, the school that they're sitting in, recoups the funding from the other local authority. In special schools, we've got 78 pupils at the moment that are the responsibility of other local authorities. SEN do the recoupment on all the special school places, regardless of whether they're lack or non-lack. That's so that we can actually monitor what's going on and what students we've got in our special provision. So that has increased significantly, particularly in Shenstone and Braids. And because they are quite expensive placement, that's where a lot of the additional funding has come from. So it's where we're recouping money from other local authorities.
So does that money then go out and into the schools?
That money stays in the high needs block and it forms part of the surplus carried forward. So it will form part of the carry forward that we will put into next year, that we'll utilise to spend on either additional EHCP students or more places next year. It stays in the high needs block. It's carried forward. We don't lose it.
Thank you, Julie. Sally, does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. Wendy?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So are you saying the 78 children, out of borough children who come into our special schools, is that a higher number than it has been previously?
Should I answer this one, Julie?
Yes, you can if you like, Moira.
I think it is slightly higher than we have in the past. And I think, again, that's because of the competition between local authorities to get specialist places, but also with in terms of specialist academies. In terms of mainstream or maintained special schools, the local authority has a bit of control over who would get the place. With academies, other local authorities can go straight to the academy because they're their own admissions authority, and they can go through them. So the local authority cannot, I
understand that, and I know we've talked a lot in the past about Sandwell children going out of borough and the cost that is as well. And it's in one breath, it's great to see that money being recouped, However, I guess the other thing is when we know we've got Sandwell children who we can't get into Sandwell special schools, then I know that's not the financial part, but that's obviously, for me, and I'm sure other heads are concerned, because ultimately we want our own children in our schools. The other point I was going to ask, maybe when the carry forward is obviously gone up now to 2.986 million, and I know you said you're going to do some budget forecasts. Does that mean the previous work that we've done when it was the SEN consultation is that obviously the problem hasn't gone away with the future of high needs block, but maybe it isn't as bad a state as what we predicted because the carry forward's larger? Would that be accurate to say?
It's not gone away, and although the carry forward is slightly larger, £500,000 of that is relating to last year that we brought forward from 2021. It's not gone away. We actually budgeted for a certain amount of surplus in the figures that we did under the consultation. It's obviously just a little bit more now as we move on through the year, and we'll take that on board when we do the next lot of cash flow forecasts.
Because it's similar almost what we were saying about whole school budgets and kind of, it's almost, I think, and what Andrew was saying, that's fine if we've got kind of plans for the future, but we don't want to be keeping onto that money when we've all got children in our school who desperately need, I guess, the support there as well, isn't it? It's trying to create the balance, and obviously at the moment we're talking about SEN, but previously we're talking about whole school budgets. It's the same predicament, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why part of the consultation was looking at developments for special school places and specialist provision. That cohort of students are still there, although some of those have had allocations this year. Some will be included in the budget that I'll go through with you shortly. Some are in there, but we've still got a shortfall of places that we need to accommodate for in future years. That's why the next point after the budget preparation is looking at the cash flow forecast, looking at the numbers, and then doing another prediction of what we think that will look like going forward. In answer to your question about, as Moira said, about the academies and not having as much control on who is going into academy schools, that is one of the reasons why, as a local authority, we do the recruitment on behalf of the schools so that we can actually see which children are in, where they are, and so that we know exactly how many places are allocated to Sandwell pupils and how many are allocated to out-of-borough pupils, so that we can keep an idea on our occupancy and control it.
Thank you.
Dave?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Just to kind of build on that point as well, because I know from conversations with Neil and so on that he's already getting referrals from out of borough for next academic year, and a knock-on consequence of that will be that we won't have the number of places that available that we're projecting we're going to need unless we, as a local authority, get our referrals in sooner. And the knock-on impact of that, if we don't do that, the knock-on impact is that we have to spend more of the high needs block outside of the borough. So is there a process to get referrals in so that we can secure places with the academy? Because if we identify that that is an issue because they're their own local admissions authority, then surely we should also recognise that we need to get those places secured as soon as possible.
Yeah, I totally agree, Dave. So in terms of phase transfers, all special schools should have received the consultations and should know basically now which children they'll be having, for instance, in year 7, and which children we'll be looking for at year 2, and also in terms of children coming into school at reception. So we're sorting that out now. I think the issue for kind of like SEN and for special schools is that we can get an EHCP request for a specialist place at any time throughout the year. So we have to be really quick in terms of our consultation processes throughout the year in order to try and secure that specialist place. So we are working on our consultations. We are working on kind of like the speed of which we can get our consultations out, but because it's a needs-based system and the need can happen throughout the year, it's hard then to predict in terms of when the empty spaces will be.
So sorry, Maura, are you then saying that for all the consultations that you have so far, you have requested places, and therefore, as far as you're concerned, there isn't going to be a immediate shortfall in need for Sandwell children?
So within the phase transfer, we've already consulted on all those places. There might be a shortfall for Sandwell children because, like I say, those consultations can come in throughout the year.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Coldeep. You're on mute, Coldeep.
Yeah, my question was just very similar, really. I just wondered, do we know how many places there are at Shenston and how many are taken up by Sandwell children? So how many are out of borough children, I suppose?
Yeah, so in terms of the total between Shenston and Braids, we commissioned 95 places. And at the moment, out of borough, Shenston have got 33 and Braids have got 7.
Okay. It's on Appendix 2, Coldeep. The breakdown's on Appendix 2.
Yeah, so I suppose I would just reiterate what people have said, because when the EHCPs come halfway through the year, it's really difficult for schools to get a place. And then there obviously are a lot of out of borough children in those places, which makes it tricky for Sandwell schools. Yeah, thank you, Chair.
I think the issue as well with them sometimes is other local authorities can direct if we have a space. So it may be that we've got 2 spaces, and if another local authority knows that we've got that space, they can name it on the EHCP, which is another issue. And we've also got to take account of all the current out of borough pupils that are still actually in Shenston, and they are in the lower age groups that are still going to work their way through into year 6 and into year 7. We have to take into account for those as well.
Thank you, Julie. Wendy?
See, that number out of borough for Shenston seems pretty high. Is that because of the location of it as well? So you've got obviously children from the Lichfield, Staffordshire area.
Yeah, I mean, there's different local authorities placing in Shenston, but its location in Staffordshire. Yeah,
we're looking at
it's the closest school for a lot of children as well.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions before we move on? No. Okay, so minute that we've noted the content of that report, and in terms of noting the impact of the increased surplus on future years, we recognise that there's some more forecasting to come, so that we can understand what the impact on that deficit is in more detail. Okay, so item 7, which is the PRU report. Moira, are you leading this one?
I think it's actually Julie who's going to be saying who's going through this one.
Lovely. You're muted, Julie.
Sorry. This is for information. It was something the Schools Forum requested in previous meetings, and it was just to go through how the funding works in the various PRUs. So I'll start with Primrose PRU. The local authority commissioned 25 places a year at £10,000 per place. We also commissioned Element 3 top up for 20 of those places at 11,920 to cater for any students that are permanently excluded during the year. The additional 5 places are preventative places, and the top-up is chargeable to schools who use the service. Table 1 shows the funding for Primrose in 21-22. So you can see we funded 25 places at £10,000 per place, 250,000. We funded 20 places at 11,920, which is 338,400. We don't fund the preventative places through the high needs block. That will be funding that comes directly to the PRU via schools. And then we've got the teachers' pay and pensions grant that was funded in additional. So overall, the PRU funding from the high needs block was 514,800. I've had a look at the pupils that are coming through. And as we know, that the PERMEX pupils in primary are reducing. So at the moment, although we budgeted for 20, the actual footfall of students going in that were permanently excluded was 8, and that equates to an average on roll of 4. We had 3 pupils, whole time equivalent of 2, that was put into Primrose Prue that was that didn't have a school place. That could be a child that's moved into the borough that we need to provide education for on day 6. The average occupancy for preventative places, which is where schools pay, was 5. The actual footfall was 36, and the whole time equivalent was 20. So overall, at the moment, Primrose are showing vacancies of 5, but because the Prues are a revolving door, that can change quite quickly. All this information was as at the middle of February. So obviously it doesn't include, because I know Culdip's on the call, it won't include any students that have gone in between February and now. So as I've said before, the number of permanently excluded places funded through the High Needs Block Elementary is reducing, and pupils on preventative places are filling the vacancies. Primrose currently charge £95 per place for a preventative place, and at the time of this report, Primrose had 17 pupils on roll. As I've said, that can change. So is there any questions on Primrose first?
Sorry, Julie, can I just ask, so then this will be the same question for each of the Prues based on the occupancy. So my reading of that is that Primrose have been funded for 20 places, have only actually had 8 children in for that funding, and that of the 36, which is 14, that they've been funded additionally for that, but from the schools. So that we've not used 12 of the places essentially, or 16 of the places, if you like, that we funded throughout the year.
Not through the High Needs Block. So, Moira, I don't know whether you want to say anything there or called it, because as I say, we can't because the Primrose Prue is such a small Prue, we have to look at it quite carefully and look at the permanently excluded places. But yes, you're right. We've paid for 20 permanently excluded places at the top up, but we haven't had that many permanently excluded pupils in this financial year.
But we've still paid the funding for them, and yeah, the places that we funded have been used for alternative. The capacity has been used for alternative provision, and they've charged again for that. I can't comment on what income the school have charged. All we know is that the charge is £95 a day. I don't see that side of the ledger. I only see the High Needs Block side. So I couldn't categorically say what income Primrose Prue has had in for those preventative places.
Moira, is that something you were able to comment on, or?
I also don't know how much income Primrose Prue have had for those preventative places.
And just to be clear, I'm not criticising Primrose. I just want to be clear that the capacity, their staffing is based on the funding that we're giving them, based on what we say the need is going to be. Yeah. That need isn't being taken up by us, and therefore they're not adding additional staffing to pay for the preventative places that they've got. That's the only point I'm just trying to acknowledge, and it'll be very similar when we come down into STS and so on. So I think it's important that we understand that, because we need to understand what is happening with our funding when we're talking about places available, and whether there are places available. If they're being taken up by preventative placements, which are not the placements that the local authority are funding, if the commission places are not being used, they should be available, and it's just making sure that we understand that process.
I think that's a fair point, Dave, and I think I would reiterate what you said earlier, that it's not dig at Primrose at all. It's just really understanding how the funding is being used, in understanding if they are essentially being double funded, what that looks like. So do we need to have an action point that somebody will look into that a bit further and perhaps report back at the next schools forum meeting?
Do you want me to look into that further?
Yes, please. Thank you. And I think, just to clarify more, it's just understanding if they're not using the commissioned places and they're selling them as preventative placements, what that looks like in terms of funding for each of the centres, not just Primrose.
Yeah.
Okay, so Julie, returning to you to continue taking us through the report.
Yeah, SCS, Sandwell Community School, is funded in exactly the same way, just different amounts of places. So the local authority commissions 180 places at £10,000 per place, and Element 3 top up for 80 of those places at £7,346 per place, and that's to cater for any permanently excluded students. Table 3 again shows the funding. So you can see the 180 places at £10,000 per place is 1.8 million. Top up for permanently excluded pupils is 80 at 7,346. And then there's 100 preventative places where the high needs block doesn't fund any top up at all for those students, and that comes directly from schools or whoever places the students in the provision. We do make an adjustment for 78,200, and this was the building costs of the school moving out of the Tipton site when Albright moved into Tipton, because that again was something that they no longer needed to pay, so that was made as a reduction to their budget. And again, they get the teachers' pay and pensions of 119,000. So the total funding for SCS for 21-22 was 2.428 million. The same scenario applies as we've gone through with Primrose. The average occupancy for permanent excluded pupils, we fund 80. Footfall is 102, but the actual whole time equivalence is 64. Average occupancy where there's been where the students come into the borough and there's no school place, whole time equivalence is 2. The average occupancy for alternative provision panel funded through the high needs block, so these are the ones that come through the alternative provision panel that Moira chairs, that's 1 whole time equivalent. The average occupancy for preventative places, this is the places that the schools fund. The footfall was 80, whole time equivalence was 30. Average occupancy that came through the Fair Access panel, funded through the Fair Access panel funding, was 9 pupils, 6 whole time equivalents. And there's queries, well, not queries, but there's no funding agreed, which are very short term occupancy. And these are students that are in there for a day or 2 days or perhaps a week at the most. We don't put funding in for those at all. There was 15 of those and they equate to 3 whole time equivalents. There were queries on the pupil tracking of 21 whole time equivalent students, 31 students in total where we're not sure, well, not sure, but where we are asking more information on where the top-up funding should come from for those students. So overall, the average occupancy for SCS, again, middle of February, was 127. So we provide Element 3 top-up for 80. We've earmarked for permanently excluded pupils, items 1, 2 and 3 in the table above will be funded through the high needs block and will be counted against those 80 places. So the average occupancy for those categories is 67. Item 4, again funded through schools, average is 30. SCS charge on average between £50 and £125 a day for preventative places, dependent upon the age and the needs of the student. Fair Access panel have already agreed to fund item 5 in the table, so that one's quite clear. Item 6, these are students, as I've said, where there will be no funding because they appear on the roll of SCS for a very short period of time, or where they're the responsibility of another local authority. There's only 1 or 2 of those. And item 7 are the pupils on roll. The agreement has not yet been reached, so discussions around those are still continuing, and that's a discussion that we need to have with SCS. Overall, there'll be an average of 53 unoccupied funded places at £10,000 per place in SCS during 21-22. And at the time of the report, SCS had 127 pupils on roll, physically on roll. So that's the end of SCS. So the same questions I would guess are going to apply to SCS as applied to Primrose Prue.
Yeah, Dave?
Yeah, sorry to prolong this, but my issue is that with the pressures on the high needs block, it would appear that SCS are saying to us which ones are funded rather than the other way around. So, for example, if the local authority have got 80 places, it's up to the local authority to say who is where. And I don't, for example, understand why Fair Access, which is an arm of the local authority, are being charged for the 6 places that they've allocated when the local authority have already funded those places and they're not all being taken up. So part of what I would be suggesting is that we need to go back to SCS and say, well, actually, we've got, as a local authority, we've got spaces available, and we're going to say that child, and that child fit in there, so that the pressure is, some pressure is taken off either Fair Access or the high needs block, because the places are already commissioned, and as we can identify, they're not being used. So it should be either up to Fair Access Management Board or Moira Inclusion Support to dictate which children go into the spaces that are funded by Inclusion Support.
Yeah, so I would say in terms of those pupils that are under query, a lot of those have come through the Fair Access panel. So I would suggest that in terms of those free places, that well, not free places, but the places that are the PX places in terms of the top-up funding that are currently not being used. I think in terms of the AP panel and in terms of IS will determine in terms of which pupils and how that funding is used, if that's all okay.
Thank you. And will you report back on that as well at the next meeting with the original report as well? Yeah,
of course.
Wendy?
I'm not sure if this is somewhere else in the agenda, but what we're saying on both of the proofs then is that we're not using the commission places for different reasons. So what are the commission places for the new financial year? Are they still the same, or have there been adjustments made?
They're still the same at the moment in terms of the commission places for PXs. I think what we'll need to do going forward is look at kind of like basically the funding for Primrose to make sure that they can still operate as a centre. They need a certain amount of funding. However, it might be that we don't commission as many PX places, but we need to look at the funding as a whole, because not many primary age children get excluded, which is great, but that shouldn't be to the detriment of Primrose, who provides a great service in terms of preventative. In terms of SCS, unfortunately, PXs are rising slightly this year. So I would say we keep a good eye in terms of the monitoring of the PXs, but also the preventative places, and we can recommission kind of like based on information each financial year. So I would suggest that we look very carefully and monitor again for another year, and then look to see if we need to recommission.
Thank you. And Judy, back to you to finish with the Albright Centre.
Yeah, Albright are funded differently to the other two PRUs because it's our home education. It's our home education and hospital provision. So the DfE have stated, so as Albright Education is a PRU, the DfE have stated that they cannot be treated as a post-16 establishment and receive additional funding from the ASFA for any students that are post-16, as can SCS can't either. The local authority originally commissioned 40 places a year at Albright. This was increased to 10 places to provide Albright Education with 50 commission places at £10,000 per place in this financial year. They don't receive any Element 3 top-up at all for their students, but they receive a lump sum determined by the DfE in the funding formula designated for home and hospital tuition. So in the table below, you can see the 40 places at £10,000 per place, 400,000. The additional 10 places at £10,000 a place, which was 100,000. the lump sum for home and hospital tuition was 759,200, and then the teachers' pay and pension grant was 38,000 to give them a total of 1.297 million. Table 6 again shows the average occupancy for the summer term, and that was between the summer term and the autumn term and spring to date again, so to the middle of February. Pupil numbers only include the hospital tuition data if they're actually on roll at the time that we look at the pupil tracking. So what we don't have from Primrose is any students that they see in hospitals unless they are on roll at that date, because obviously the numbers are change quite frequently and they are quite short-term education offers. So at the moment, the average occupancy is 22 full-time, 9 part-time, and we've got 2 post-16. So again, because the Primrose Pro is a revolving door, so students are in there and move out. 101 students actually went through Primrose.
Albright, Julie.
Albright, sorry, Albright. I could see you saying Albright, Moira. Move through Albright. There's only 30, the average is 33 students on roll at the middle of February. At the time of the report, Albright had 55 pupils on roll, so they'd actually gone over their pupil numbers in commission places, but pupils on roll, but 3 were full-time post-16 students and 15 were part-time students, and that's where the difference is with the 33 whole-time equivalents. But as I say, Primrose are funded completely differently. They don't get top-up per student.
Right.
Albright are completely different. They don't get funding per student. They get a lump sum. So is there any questions on Albright?
Can I ask one question, Julie? Why did we commission a further 10 places if the average number of pupils on roll was 33? Was there a reason for that? Was it about funding? Moira?
I will answer that one, Jamie. They were commissioned a while ago so that Albright could start supporting children within Key Stage 2. So that they were commissioned an additional 10 places 2 years ago. Obviously, the impact of COVID has had a huge impact on children within that time frame, within that 2 years. However, what we're seeing now, reported through Albright, is that they're getting a much larger footfall in centre at the moment. So that's why we commissioned those additional places, because we were fully expecting more children with mental health difficulties within Key Stage 2 to be included.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments for Julie or Moira? No? Okay, so we'll note that we've we've noted the contents of that report, and we'll look forward to the follow-up in the June meeting. So moving on then to item number 8, the early years provider rates for 22-23. Is that, I haven't got a name by that agenda item, is that going to Rose?
It's me, Jamie. Sarah.
Oh, sorry, Sarah, I didn't see you there.
Last year, there will be a decision at the end of this item as well for members to accept or not the changes. So in October last year, 21, the Chancellor announced a 3-year rolling programme of increases for the universal entitlement of funding for 2-year-olds and 3 and 4-year-olds. It's split up into 3 different years, and there's 3 different amounts just to make it even more complicated. This year, the increase will be 160 million nationally for places. In 23-24, it will be 170 million, and 24 to 25, it's 170 million. So this year, our increase was then published on the 25th of November, and the DFE suggested that our rates for 2-year-olds increased by 21 pence per hour per 2-year-old, from £5.38 to £5.59. They also suggested that for our 3 and 4 year olds rate, that the increase would be 17 pence per hour per child, and so that the basic rate, also that the rate would be from £4.06 to £4.23. We are required to have a single funding formula in Sandwell, which we have. So we have, the way our funding is worked in early years, we have a basic rate. We also then have additional funding for flexibility, because as a local authority we have a duty to provide enough childcare for parents, and particularly working parents who want it, and that does require a degree of flexibility. We also have a deprivation payment as well, and that depends on the number of children in each earlier setting that fall into a deprivation postcode. That's the child's postcode, not the school's postcode. So that deprivation rate will change each cohort. Because the pandemic has had quite a big impact on particularly early years providers, our choice this year, I think, will be to increase the basic rate for everybody, because that means then that everybody will see an increase. Everybody will see an increase in their early years funding. So the consultation that went out at the beginning of February was to ask all early years providers whether they agreed that we would use all of the uplifting funding that we've been given from the DFE to increase the basic rate for 2-year-olds and for 3 and 4 year olds. The consultation ran for 2 weeks. We had a total of 40 responses. In terms of 2-year-old providers, we had one person who disagreed, everybody else agreed. And in the case of 3 and 4 year old funding, we had 100% agreements. I think that the response to the consultation was quite low, but I think it's because it was in everybody's interest, because everybody sees an increase in their basic rate for their children. So we will see this exercise again next year, and again the year after as well. So we will see a year-on-year gain and an uplift in the universal funding for early years children. So unless anybody's got any questions, I think that's the decision. If the schools forum agrees with the consultation, and that we use all of the funding to increase the 2-year-old by 21 pence an hour and the 3 and 4 year old funding by 17 pence an hour for all providers, including schools, of course.
Sarah, any comments or questions for Sarah? No? Okay, in which case we'll move to the vote.
Jamie,
yes.
sorry, just before you do, this one is for all school members, so basically everyone can vote except Jane and Phil as non-school members.
Yeah. And do we have to vote for both separately, Fred, or do we just vote for both of these recommendations together?
I think to be clear, separately would be better, Chair.
Okay, so the first recommendation then is to approve the increase of the 2-year-old hourly rate from £5.38 to £5.59. So all those in favour, raise your hands. Okay, so that's 8 on screen and Bob, so that's 9 votes in favour. Anybody against? Anybody abstaining? Okay, that's carried, thank you. And the second recommendation is to approve the increase of the 3 and 4 year old hourly rate from £4.06 to £4.23. So all those in favour? And again, that's 9, including Bob. So we can presume there's no abstentions or anybody against. So that's carried as well. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so then moving on, then item 9 on the agenda, DSG allocation, 21-22 update. So back to you, Rose.
Okay, thank you. So yes, this is just to provide forum members with an update on the allocation, DSG allocation, and the table set out in section 3.1 gives the latest information compared to the original allocation announced in December 2020. So in terms of the schools block and the central school services block, there's no change in the allocation. So 297.5 million for schools block and 2.249 million for the central school services block. With the high needs block, I think there's an increase overall from 55.738 million to just over 56 million, so a 339,000 increase. And then with the early years block, there's been a decrease in the funding from 24,877,000 down to 22.715 million. So a decrease overall of 2.162 million. Now, the original DSG allocation was presented to Schools Forum in January 2021, and then the changes that have arisen since then, for noting is that in terms of the schools block, there's an academy recruitment of 146, just under 146.5 million in terms of the schools block. And that's funding that's given direct by the Education and Skills to the trusts and academies. There's also an increase, as stated, of that 339 million to the high needs block, and that's due to a change in the import-export adjustment. So that's gone from a minus 204 million to a plus 141 million. So that's a movement, a positive movement of £345,000. And then also an adjustment to funding for special free schools. So in the initial allocation, we had 6,000, and then now that's been removed. That makes up that 339,000 movement. And also since then, in that initial allocation, for the high needs block, there was a recruitment amounting to 2.072 million. That's related to places that are funded directly by the ESFA. So that's with academies. And then, but there's been a further increase in terms of recruitment of 450,000 overall. And that is due to the following. So there's a decrease of 6 places for pre-16 focus provision places. That's at the £6,000 level. So that was an adjustment of 21,000. There's an increase of 6 places for pre-16 at £10,000. And so that's a 35,000 adjustment. And then the major changes related to the increase of 109 places in further education and independent learning providers. So that's an adjustment of 436,000 altogether. And then with regard to that decrease of 2.162 million in terms of the early years block, the change in funding is detailed under 3.6. So there's a reduction in the universal funding of 3 and 4 year olds of 614 because of a reduction of part-time places, 614. So that amounts to 1.6 million. And then there was also a reduction in the number of funded places for the additional 15-hour entitlement for eligible working parents. That's 95 places. So that's a 248,000 reduction. And then in terms of 2-year-old entitlement, a reduction of 111 places. So that's a 343,000 pound reduction. And then a small increase in the indicative funding for early years pupil premium. Now, all this is based on, I've just realised I haven't got my camera on. All this is based on the censuses for taken up in this financial year. So the May, the October, and then the latest one was the believe it's the trying to think if this is the January one is included. I don't think the January one is included because we wouldn't have that information as yet. So yeah, it's based on the census in May and October taken up. So this report is for noting, Chair.
Thank you. Thanks, Rose. Any comments or questions? Okay, we can minute then that report is formally noted, and thank you, Rose, again. Okay, item 10, special educational needs, high needs block 2022-23 budget. So we know this was received after the initial agenda publication, but nevertheless, it's important we have a look at it. Is this you, Julie, or is it Moira?
It's me.
It's
and
you.
Moira will chip in. Yeah, the reason it was late is because we didn't actually finalise the figures until after the reports were due to go out, so the report hadn't been written. So it was put through and sent to you last week so that you could have a look at it. So this is the high needs block, and it's for noting 22-23 budget. The provisional grant for 22-23 is 61.267 million. After deductions of 3.13 million, the grant available for distribution equates to 58.137 million. Table 1 shows the deductions of the £3 million which are made at source to the high needs block and paid directly to various establishments. The deductions are revised during the year, as Rose has just stated. It's revised depending upon the census. And a further deduction is anticipated for High Point Free School, following the place change notification that went through in November 21. So the deductions, we've got pre-16 Focus Academy place deductions of 480,000. We've got Special School Academy and Free School place deductions of 1.33 million. Post-16 SEN Mainstream and Maintained Academy deductions of 66,000. And we've got further education colleges and training providers at 1.254 million. So that gives us the 3.13 million that's deducted at source and passported to the various establishments. There is more detail on Appendix 1 of what has made up all of these figures, but this is just a brief overview of the 58 million and how it was spent, how it's been allocated. So independent schools, we've got 5.9 million. Other local authority maintained and academy mainstream schools, so these are other local authority maintained academies where we place our children in their schools, 1.8 million. Funding delegated to schools, PRUs and post-16 is 38.4 million. Other SEN AP provision is 280,000. That covers NT&AS and any targeted support. Hospital PRU, which is Albright, is 1.59 million. SEN support services are 1.46 million. SEN support services are SEN staffing. It's also high cost equipment and other. Support for inclusion, which will include inclusion support, CCAT team, PPE team, SEMH team, CCAT team, sensory, that is support for inclusion. Alternative provision is £410,000 this year. SEN developments is 1.7 million. Other high needs expenditure is 1.6. Exclusions and reintegration is 156,000, and that gives you the total of 58,137. As I said, there's a more detailed breakdown at Appendix 1. So if anybody wants to have a quick look at Appendix 1 and raise queries from that, then I'll try and answer those. Appendix 2 shows more detailed breakdown of items 9 and 10, which I think was requested at the last schools forum meeting. These are the SEN developments and the other high needs expenditure. Budgeted specialist places, we've budgeted for 1,267 whole-time equivalent specialist places in Sandwell provisions across special schools, mainstream, focus provision and PRUs. This is an increase of 109 additional places from the 21-22 budget that was reported to Schools Forum in June 21. And the table 3 shows you the commission places that we have budgeted for in this financial year. So Orchard 147, Meadows 215, Westminster 241, Shenstone Lodge and Braids 95. High Point, we've got 50. Elms is a whole-time equivalent from the 1st of September 22, so the whole-time equivalent is 21. Westminster SPI is 12. Additional budget places in the year I've allowed for 20 places if any of our provisions go over numbers during the year, and we ask them to take additional places over and above the commissioned agreed places. Additional places at Shenstone Lodge are still to be agreed, and they're still under negotiation at the moment, so I've not included those. In focus provisions, we've got 63 commission places for ASD, 12 for physical disabilities, 10 for MLD, 12 for hearing impaired, sensory, 25 for SEMH, speech and language and communication needs is 2, and SLD is 11, and that is a new focus provision that we're anticipating from the 1st of September of 20 places. That's a total of 135 in primary. Secondary schools, we've got 45 ASD, 20 PD, 5 HI and 6 SEMH, which again is a whole-time equivalent for a new provision that we're developing from the 1st of September 2022, so the total is 76. Total focus provision places overall is 211. Again, we've got the 25 in Primrose Prue, 180 in Sandwell Community School, and the 50 places in Albright. So the total places for the Prue are 255. So this is just to note. So if you want to have a look at the Appendix 1, if you've got any questions on that, I'll try and answer those.
Thank you, Julie. Any comments or questions from anybody? Could I just ask one question of Moira or Julie? The focus provisions that are being planned from September, are they allocated, or are they going to be, ones that you're asking schools to bid for or express an interest in?
One has been allocated already, and that's the SLD focus provision. The new SP for SEMH in secondary hasn't been allocated yet. If any schools want to open up a focus provision, they're more than welcome to have that conversation with me.
Do things like that go out in bulletins, Moira, so that all schools have got an opportunity to express an interest if they wanted to open up focus provision?
Yeah, so generally what we usually do when we open new focus provisions is we go out to all schools. The focus provision that's opening in September already has a focus provision within its school, so we're just basically extending it and making it very much larger.
That makes sense, but if it's a new provision altogether, all schools are seeking the opportunity for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, lovely. Any other questions or comments? No? Okay, so in that case, we can minute that we've noted that report, and that brings us, if I'm correct, Fred, to the end of our agenda.
There are a few more verbal items.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. Another page there. So item 11, Schools Forum member training, verbal update from you, Fred.
That's right, yeah, thank you, Chair. So just to bring to members' attention, as they're probably aware, we're looking at doing some training for members, especially new ones that have come on board. So officers have had a meeting recently, and we've kind of set out the training programme, what needs to be covered. We're currently writing that training material now. What we'll do is, when we've actually written that material, we'll share it with the Chair and Vice Chair as like a sense check-in sort of exercise to see if it covers what we think it needs to cover. And then perhaps after that, we'll go out to members as well. Before what we'll do ultimately is we'll agree some separate dates outside of the Schools Forum meetings to actually hold that training. And any new members that come on board, a copy of that training, that recording will be generated so that those new members that come on board can actually have that training as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Fred, and thanks to those that worked on that behind the scenes.
No problem.
And item 12, substitute members, verbal update from you, Fred?
Yes, so something that should have happened but hasn't is that whenever someone's appointed to the forum, a substitute member should also be nominated at the same time in case that substantive member isn't able to actually attend a meeting. Their substitute can. So what I'm going to do in between now and the next meeting, Chair, is just lay out the actual process for that, send it out to all members, and if you can go back to your respective groups and get some nominations in. There's obviously we have got a few nominated subs like we've done for yourself today, Chair. But what I'll do, I'll put it all out in an email, explain exactly who has got substitutes, who hasn't, what the process is, and then we'll hopefully get that fed back to your group so that we can nominate some substitutes going forward. So if any substantive members can't attend, a substitute member can step in and take their place. Outside of that, substitute members can actually come along and observe still, but they can't take place if the substantive member is actually at the meeting. But I'll lay this all out in the email, and then hopefully what we'll do is we'll avoid a situation where if we get a number of apologies, we can't proceed because we haven't got a quorum. Andy, thank you.
Sorry, Fred, I'm just thinking we've got JEG coming up this week. We've got some partnership meetings. If you can put a few words down as to what you're going to do, what you want, I'll gladly sort of just publicise it for you. All right.
Okay, Andy, thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Okay. Anything else, Fred, for that item?
That's it then. Just the final one for Andy.
Item 13. So, Andy, a working group to look at union facilities time.
Yeah, this follows on, I think, from the voting that happened back in December. I think it was felt that it would be useful. I think you were possibly one, Chair. Felt it would be useful to have a conversation with unions about facilities time, and I think unions are quite happy to have that conversation. So really what I'm looking for is a representative really for perhaps a secondary academy, primary academy, secondary maintained and primary maintained, really, if that's helpful. So I don't know, got any volunteers who would be just willing to come along? Date to be confirmed. So it's not like you're going to do a date. We'll get one of the admin staff to run some dates around so we can get together.
I mean, I'd be happy to be part of that, Andy.
Thank you, Jamie.
Anybody else would be interested? Lucy, is that an expression or a question?
Expression.
Thank you, Lucy. Really good. Dave, would you be prepared to come, Dave Irish?
He's left. He had to go, I'm afraid.
Has he gone? Oh my goodness. The other thing is Christina's not here today either. I don't know whether we can, in her absence, agree that I'll contact her and see whether she would be willing to come along.
Well, I think
we do need representation from secondary, I think. Sorry, Jamie, I thought.
No, I was just going to say, unless there are any other volunteers here, I think it's fair enough to approach individuals that you would think be suitable.
I mean, James is on the call. I don't know. It's up to you, James. Okay, it's quite happy. Don't mind.
Yeah, I stayed quiet intentionally, Andy.
That's all right. I'll keep you out of it then. Well, you can note a minute. I will contact Dave and Christina then. In that case, if that's okay, and then obviously if James, Lucy, if you're happy, we'll then be in touch shortly.
There's also Mark Arnold that isn't here, Andy.
Would Mark like to? No, I'll stick with Dave.
Thank you. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Any other business from anybody?
Yes, Chair, just one last thing to raise, thank you. Something that I actually missed a while back, actually. Both Mark Arnold and Dave Irish actually were recommended by their respective groups to actually have another term of office back in November, and unfortunately I missed that, so apologies. So just to put, not actually both of those are not actually in the meeting at the moment, so just to put to the vote that both Mark Arnold and Dave Irish, they actually have a new term of office for 4 years, if we can put that to the vote.
Okay, so what are we voting for? To just continue their term of office?
It's for another 4 years, if that's okay.
Yeah. Okay. And is this vote open to everybody, Fred?
It's to everyone, that's right,
yeah. Okay, so all those in favour of extending their term of office? Yeah, 7 plus 8 plus Bob, that's 9. Okay. Anybody against? Any abstentions? Okay, that's carried then, I think.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, any other business from anybody else? Lovely. So our next meeting is on Monday the 20th of June, And am I right, Fred, in thinking that that will be in person at the council house?
Yes, most likely. We've got the room booked, so unless we get bumped by another meeting, we'll definitely be in the council house. But I'll confirm, obviously, near the time.
Okay then. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks, Jamie.